I'm sure everyone knows the famous story of the 6 blind men and the elephant. One is at the tail, one is at a leg, one is at a side, one is at an ear, one is at a tusk, and one is at the trunk. And each of them feels the elephant and then begins to describe it. And of course, each description is very different. The description of the tail is very different from the description of the leg, and so on. And we can imagine these blind men, all of them convinced of their own truths, all of them certain that they are correct. So the person feeling the tusk obviously thinks that the elephant is very different from the person feeling the ear. And in most of the versions of the story, they quarrel and fall out. The story is often told in our churches. I've heard it told many times in slightly different variants. But it's interesting to think where it comes from. The earliest version of this story, as far as I'm aware, is found in a Buddhist manuscript. It's known in Hinduism, it's known in Jainism, and it's found in Sufi writings. So we can see that it's found in these different traditions, in the Islamic, Hindu and Jain tradition, as well as in the Buddhist tradition. And that reminds us that in our system, we're prepared to learn from sources other than Scripture and be guided, take guidance from sources other than Scripture. And the message of this story, which is sometimes referred to as a parable, and which is indeed a very clear metaphor for difference, gives us insight into the fissures and schisms in Christianity. Some of these fissures and schisms are about certainties of doctrine and deep doctrinal division, and some have been over as little as whether or not leavened bread should be used for the Lord's Supper. And so we've been divided, and each of us thinking that our own partial truth, true in itself, is absolute truth. If we are overly certain about this, then this is what leads us into division. Now, in our own non-subscribing tradition, of course, it's interesting that we describe ourselves and define ourselves by what we're not. We're not subscribers, we're non-subscribers. We don't make it compulsory to sign up to creeds or confessions. And this is something that I personally find extremely appealing. So much so that I joined the non-subscribers from a different tradition. I was brought up in the Church of Ireland in the Anglican tradition, and I was once asked how I could have borne to leave the Anglican tradition with its beauty of liturgy to come into something that's perhaps much simpler. And I find that an interesting question. I do love liturgy. I love the beauty of the Anglican liturgy. I was a student in York many years ago, and I had the wonderful experience sometimes of worshipping in the great medieval minster there, and the surroundings, the music, the ancient stained glass, the wonderful architecture, and the liturgy, of course, all combined to provide a very special experience that I'll never forget. I've had the privilege of worshipping in Westminster Cathedral, in Notre Dame, for example. And once again, as a student, this time of theology, I had the opportunity to go on a study trip to Rome. And one Sunday morning, I got up very early to go with a group of us along to St. Peter's to attend an English language service there in a beautiful side chapel. All of these traditions gave me something different. All of them were enriching. So too was the experience of joining in with Quaker services, to sit for an hour perhaps in total silence, a complete contrast from the grandeur of the services in those medieval churches. So we can learn from each other, we can draw on each other's traditions, we can be ready to take an ecumenical approach to explore and see what other traditions have to offer us. We don't have to be divided by our differences. The psalmist puts it this way. We're told this psalm is written by David himself. Beautiful, short psalm, 133. Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded his blessing, life forevermore. Psalmist doesn't ask us to dwell in uniformity. He doesn't ask us that we forget about our differences. What he tells us is that we are blessed to dwell in unity. to learn to find our way through difference, to learn first to respect one another's differences, and then to learn from the different traditions. And in that way, through an ecumenical approach, we can all learn a little more.